This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host.
Welcome everyone. This is the Meaningful Sport podcast, and I am your host, Noora Ronkainen. Meaningful Sport is a series of discussions on the why and how involvement in sport and physical activity can be an important part of a life worth living. If you are interested in the theme, you might also want to check out meaningfulsport.com. There you can find podcast show notes, read a blog, and access many resources for further explorations of meaningful sport. Welcome back to listening to our discussion on flow in sport, exercise, and physical activity with Dr. Trish Jackman. Trish is a lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at the University of Lincoln, and she has published several articles on flow, including 2 recent review articles. In the first part of our discussion with Trish, we traced some of the background and history of the concept of flow and discussed some of Trish's empirical work in this area. Today, we are focusing on methodology and how quantitative and qualitative research methods can be used in the study of flow. We will also discuss interventions to facilitate flow experiences and what might be the promising ways forward in this area. I hope you enjoy today's discussion. Let's then move on a little bit looking at the methodological side of the research and where we are at. And in your review articles, you have highlighted some of the methodological issues that we have to be thinking of when we are moving this research field forward. So you already mentioned that we have quite a lot of quantitative research on flow, which is even somewhat surprising if we think of this, how subjective and complex experience it is, that we would think that qualitative approach would be also used a lot more often. So let's start with the quantitative measures. So for researchers who are looking to do work on flow from a quantitative perspective, what would be some of the issues that you think are important to think about?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, a really important question. So there are probably a number of angles that I'd come at this from, linking back to what I've just mentioned from a conceptual perspective, would be the fact that a lot of the measures that are typically used in the literature on flow are based on these 9 dimensions framework. And if we have some uncertainty with regards to that as a concept and whether it captures flow, that then raises a little bit more doubt or concern as to the measures we're using and whether or not those measures are capturing what they intend to capture. So that is, I suppose, a first potential issue. A second would be, if we think about flow and the more recent evidence on clutch states, this idea that the flow measures, so going back to some work I published a couple of years ago, is that when we actually interview people and also look at their questionnaire scores on these 9 dimensions from the same performance, there is evidence based on that qualitative data that they could have actually completed those measures with respect to flow or to clutch. So that raises some questions as regards the discriminant validity. Can measures like this adequately capture flow and not capture another state? And I think that's somewhat problematic because the flow measures are typically completed after a performance, which is more practical if we think of it from a sport perspective or exercise perspective. Typically, in mainstream psychology, they often use what's called experience sampling, where people would fill in a short form after being beeped at potentially quite random points during the day, which from a sport perspective, that's not necessarily going to be practical because we can't really go out and disrupt people when they're in a competition. So the questionnaire was almost seen as the next best avenue. But if we think about it, if we fill in a questionnaire in relation to an activity, we're only getting one score, which is intended to capture our experience of that whole activity. However, if we actually think about the experiences we have in an activity, regardless of the length of it, generally we have quite a lot of dynamic changes and fluctuations in our experiences, and we may even have multiple experiences during that. They could be positive, they could be more negative in nature, but all we get by filling out a questionnaire is just a single score, which is trying to capture all of that. And in some respect, we're going to miss out on, number one, the dynamic nature of our experiences. Number two, also the temporal aspects. So over time, during an activity, how did our experience shift or change? So I think it's certainly very, very difficult. And I think there's widespread recognition, not just in sport and exercise, but more broadly amongst the flow researchers, that we still have not got any form of gold standard measure for flow. I think in terms of, from a flow perspective, what's going to be really important in our field in sport and exercise is trying to develop a measure that can capture flow, and equally another measure that can capture this clutch state, to ensure we can actually separate them. Because obviously, if we want to do any research that is quantitative in nature, we need to ensure that the measures we have are accurately capturing what they're intended to measure. So I think they would definitely be some of the challenges as regards the measurement of flow. I think looking more so at the literature with regards to youth, I think one of the challenges I would see based on the review we've done is that the measures that have been used in younger athletes and younger exercisers and those in physical activity, they haven't necessarily been tested in that population, both from a statistical perspective, but also from the perspective of the language and the content. And I think flow is one of those experiences that we need to consider. Will younger athletes necessarily always experience it in the same way, or will they perceive that their experience is similar? For example, if we think about, our perception of time, is that going to be the same for a youth versus an adult, and so on? So I think there are probably some questions with regards to at a population level as well to consider. But I would see some of those as maybe the main challenges that we would have at present with regards to some of the quantitative measures. And I suppose one of the issues as well is, if we conceptualize flow as is it a categorical variable or a continuous variable? And that's often a challenge, and people have tried to say if we get a score over a certain amount on this questionnaire, does that indicate we were in flow? So I think there's definitely some challenges there that would be, it would be beneficial certainly if we could overcome those in the coming years.
Yeah, and especially what you listed when we are trying to study flow with younger sport participants, that certainly sounds like one of the big challenges, to make sure that the questionnaires that are being used are also appropriate for younger children and adolescents. Yeah. How about the qualitative research? So you mentioned that there aren't a lot of studies, and in your review that's looking at youth sport and physical education, you mentioned some problems with this so-called career-based interviews. So perhaps just briefly explain what it is and what are the issues with that?
Yeah, so I suppose it's quite interesting, because I would have started out undertaking what we call career-based interviews, and have moved into conducting event-focused interviews. So that has been an interesting experience for me. If we look back at some of the early work on flow, go right back to when it started in the 1990s, the most common way that interviews were conducted was in a way in which participants were asked to recall an experience that stood out in their career, maybe one that was an example of a peak performance, and were asked to speak about that, and that was essentially assumed to be an example of flow. Now, one of the challenges with that is that, of course, those memories may stand out, and they may be, people may be capable of recalling them. However, those memories may have occurred months, years in the past. And I suppose that may present some challenges when it comes to recalling those experiences, the accuracy of that recall, and as well as that, also the level of detail that we can actually obtain. So if we look at that first 2 decades of research in this area of sport, a lot of the interview studies, they'd started to identify factors that were associated with flow. However, we were still lacking in an explanatory theory, and that's still the case even up to this day. We still don't have a way to explain the occurrence of flow. Now, it was Christian Swan in particular, and Susan Hooge Mackenzie, some of her early work as well, started to look into this idea of conducting interviews really soon after people were involved in activities, with the idea that if we can capture those experiences sooner after the event, there may be potential for us to capture more detailed information, and information that is going to hopefully help us to delve more into the potential mechanisms that underlie the occurrence of flow states. So some of Susan's work was in more leisure context, specifically looking at river surfers, and Christian's work started in 2016 when he published that paper on professional golfers. And in that study, Christian sampled people on the basis that they had an excellent performance in golf tournaments. Now, when he was started out on that study, I suppose his initial assumption was that, well, they would be in flow, but it started to become clear through those interviews that there was something a little bit different that wasn't really sitting directly in line with what we would typically consider flow. So that's where the elements of making it happen and subsequently clutch states came about. So if we look at the event-focused interview, I guess there are 3 key characteristics of this type of interview, and could be really valuable, not just in flow research, but for any researchers who are interested in learning more about specific phenomena that occur during sport and exercise activities. So the first characteristic will be that we use what is termed event contingent recording. So this idea that we try to conduct these interviews after times or events that match a specific criteria in the hope that it is likely that the phenomenon of interest has occurred. So an example of that would be in our work, if we're interested in looking at psychological states that underlie excellent performance. So if we think about the 2017 paper in Journal of Applied Sports Psychology, and if we want to understand people's experiences during excellent performance, we need to find examples of excellent performance. So that would have been our criterion for sampling in that case. That was our event contingent recording criterion. And of course, that could differ from study to study. If you're interested in studying momentum, for example, you might want to go out there and find an example of momentum in a performance, and that will be your criterion for an interview. So the first key characteristic is the sampling approach. The second is trying to capture this data as soon as possible after the event. So if we look at a lot of research in memory studies and so on, there is general acceptance that over time our memories will change. So what we're really keen to do is to try and interview people when it is as fresh as possible in their mind. And that has varied. So, I've done interviews which are no more than a few hours after an event. And that's been really beneficial in terms of capturing some of that really detailed information, because often some of those quite periphery thoughts or feelings we may have in an activity, they tend to fade away a little bit more. over time, and even over the course of a few days, we can have changes. And if you're a runner and you go out for another number of runs after that run that you've had that was really good, do you start to blur some of your experiences, or how does that change it? So we try to interview as soon as possible after. And then the third element, which I really enjoy actually using, and I think it makes for a really really nice interview experience as an interviewer, and also puts a lot of the control into the hands of the participant in many ways, is asking them to chronologically recall their experience. So essentially trying to get them to piece together what their experience was like from start to finish. So initially it's more about milestones, key stages in a performance, and so on. And that almost gives you that reference point to then start to explore chunks of that performance when their experience may have differed. And that has been really, really interesting. And I think that's one of the reasons I really enjoy interviewing is that you just learn so much about the dynamics of people's experiences, and how it can just change, and what are those transition points. And I think that's the huge advantage of being able to do it, to collect that data soon after these activities, is that we can actually really delve into those segments of performances which often occur in a really detailed way. And often those segments they're not that long. It could be, you have a stage where you're going up a hill, couple of 100 feet of gradient. It's only going to last you a certain amount of time, but even within that, there can be a huge amount of key moments or key points along the way. So the chronological recall for me is such a really valuable way to capture data on people's experiences, whether that be flow and whether that be other experience as well. And I think it's a method now that I've been using for a few years since my PhD, and it always serves up something new as well, which has always been great. So yeah, so what are event focused interviews? They vary quite a lot from the career based approach. In terms of why they've been useful, I think if we look at the progression that's been made in terms of understanding of flow in recent years, I think the event-focused interview studies that have been conducted do offer us a contrasting perspective to what is typically surfaced from those career-based interview studies. So I think that's really important, and I think has certainly helped us to advance the field. And of course, the career-based interview has its place, and it's going to be really important to answer some types of research questions. So I think that's what we're saying. We're not saying that the event-focused interview is certainly not a one-size-fits-all, and it will be useful for certain types of research questions, but not always useful for others. So I think it's probably, if we think about it as a method, it's probably fair for us to compare it to other forms of data capture soon after or during activities. So let's say, is the event-focused interview going to offer you something alternative to a post-event questionnaire, or to a think aloud method, or to an experience sampling method, for example? Is it just another, almost like a tool in our methodological toolkit in a way, I think is probably a good way of putting it, and essentially a method that can really help us to delve into people's experiences in a really interesting way.
Yeah. I was just thinking when you were talking that if we talk about athletes and we would talk about these moments of optimal performance, or these could be like competition situations, or these were some of the things that you talked about. So if I'm thinking of my own running and when I would experience something like a flow experience, that would be more often in an ordinary run than like often in these competitions. I wouldn't say they were like anywhere close to a flow experience. But if I had to think of what could be those runs when I would have a flow experience, they are probably the runs when I'm on the trails. I often don't even have a watch, so I have like no idea of what is my objective performance if I'm running fast or slow. So I'm I'm just thinking of, if we are researching flow, is it then linked to this objectively optimal performance, or is it just this subjective state of optimal challenge? Yeah, just a thought.
Definitely a thought that I've had, and one that I'm keen to, certainly as I'm getting into data analysis at the moment on a study I'm doing, and it's really an important question, I think, because especially in the sport that I'm researching in, which is in runners, who talk a lot about pacing and almost that quite thin line between giving the maximal effort and pushing it too far. And typically flow isn't being reported when they're anywhere near that. So I would say keep an eye out for that one. I'd be interested to hear others' perspectives on it as well, because I actually think it's a really important point. And I think moving forward, I think that is definitely going to be a crucial area, especially from an applied perspective. If we're thinking about athletic performance, a lot of people have typically thought that flow may be the state that we need to encourage our athletes to be in. But I think what is really important is for us to understand, is that actually the best state for us to be in? So yeah, I think it's a really good question. It's a really good question that I would have, and one I'm interested to learning more about, and hopefully developing understanding as regards that as well.
Yeah, I look forward to hearing more of your results from your study with runners as well. My next question will be moving on to then this difficulty of controlling flow and the failure of interventions to facilitate flow. So my own experiences in sport, like I won't have any idea when this flow happens or doesn't happen. I was also very poor at ever getting to my best shape on a competition day when I was running. When I was doing more running competitions, I never managed to be on my top form on that day of the race. But so for me, my sport life has been unpredictable in these certain respects. But so in your paper on youth sport, and you mentioned this challenge of we are not really being very successful in facilitating these situations where it would be more likely for participants to have flow. So maybe reflect a little bit on these interventions, or what is the practical work that can be done, and what approaches might be more promising than others.
Yeah, I think it's an important one, and I'll certainly give a nod to Scott Goddard, who's a PhD researcher at Southern Cross University in Australia, and Scott's doing a lot of work on interventions in flow, and he's conducted a systematic review as part of his PhD over the last while, which has produced some really interesting findings, and I think they chime quite well with what has been coming through in the exercise and in this recent youth review as well, is this idea that at present we don't necessarily have the interventions we would certainly like to have in order to help us to increase the intensity, the frequency of flow states, and ultimately help people to experience this more often. If we look at a lot of the interventions, particularly in sport, a lot of the interventions have often been around different psychological skills techniques, such as imagery. In exercise, there's been a few studies that have used music. In exercise as well, some studies have used exergaming. And I suppose if we think about a lot of those strategies, the theoretical underpinnings for those interventions haven't been as robust, I would say, as they could have been. And, why is it that some of these strategies might actually induce flow? I think the rationale for that needs to be much stronger. If we look at what athletes have reported qualitatively in recent years, and I think this is potentially where there are some avenues for us to start to test some of these areas, would be this idea of open goals in particular. I think that's a really interesting one in terms of, even if we look at, cognitive tasks, Matthew Schweichel's work looked at the effect of setting open versus specific goals in a cognitive task. So it's not a physical activity task, but using a measure that was essentially it's not necessarily a validated measure, but it captured elements of flow, clutch, the differentiation factors on a scale. And that indicated that setting open goals produced significantly higher flow versus clutch, and in contrast, setting specific goals produced higher levels of clutch than flow. So from that perspective, it would be really great to then start to build that into more experimental work in the field of sport exercise as well, to see, could potentially setting open goals be helpful for us. However, if we look at the process underlying flow that has been reported, there are other elements to it, of course. So there is that element of having a positive event, positive feedback, your confidence builds, challenging yourself, and then the setting of open goals. And I think another important aspect, and coming at this from a realist perspective, is the importance of context. And I think what's really important is for us to understand what works for whom and when. And if we think about flow in the context people tend to report it in, is that it is exploratory, or perceived to be exploratory, perceived to be experimental. And one of the factors that tends to inhibit it would be more pressured circumstances. So one of the typical things, certainly in my work over the years and speaking to participants, that can often trigger the disruption of flow is almost a moment of realization. You're in a performance, and then it dawns on you that this is getting quite serious, the outcome is on the line, sort of thing, which then triggers that awareness that we don't necessarily always have when we're in flow. So we start to become more aware of what's going on externally to us. So I think in terms of progress from an intervention perspective, I think it's really important for us to consider some of those potential mechanisms and how we can actually test those, and equally also considering how we test those in the appropriate contexts. From that perspective, I think it's obviously important for us to try and ensure that whatever interventions we are devising, to try and ensure that they are in line with, some evidence in the area that will actually link it to flow as well. So I think there's definitely some ideas there that we can definitely utilize and test moving forward. But as of yet, we definitely have some challenges with respect to implementing, the typical psychological skills strategies. And even if we think about those, a lot of them are going to involve an element of education when we first start to use them. Often they can engage quite a lot of higher order thinking processes as well. And I guess we need to think how well that actually sits with flow. So yeah, I think interventions are definitely an important area moving forward. And just ensuring that our interventions are really strong, really robust, I think is going to be crucial to us making much more meaningful progress in this area into the future as well.
Yeah. I mean, having all this knowledge about flow, and you've read so many studies and reviewed all these studies and spent like several years thinking about this, has it changed the way that you are practicing sport and exercise yourself? I mean, you can always do interventions with yourself. You can change the way you do things and all that. So has it had an impact on your own sport life?
Definitely. Just generally understanding this area has definitely shaped how I've performed in sport and in exercise. So like you said there, the element of the watch I think is really important when it comes to running. So on my easy running days, the watch doesn't get any attention whatsoever. It's on, but it may as well not be on, other than it's just going to give me a distance at the end, and that's pretty much it. So I think also for me personally, and often it's probably quite subtle, but being in a team sport over the years, sometimes you can often tell when either one of your teammates or your opponent may be in one of these states. And I think from that perspective, it's quite interesting. But you then try to see, well, if it's your opponent, how may you be able to curb something like this? But equally, if it is one of your teammates, how might you be able to support them? And for me, I think a big thing for me over the last few years when I was playing in my sport was just really interested in seeing beyond these normative competence goals and the typical ego goals, I would say, and using that as a barometer, whereas I've been much more interested in seeing how well we can do, how good can we be as a team, and equally as an individual, and so on, and not necessarily having that restriction on ourselves or anything like that. So that's always been really interesting for me. And I think even just learning more about this idea of clutch performance and increased performance under pressure has definitely been really interesting. I mean, I'll put my hands up. There have definitely been times where I've experienced kind of a choking type experience where I've really performed a skill so poorly in a pressure moment, but a couple of minutes later I can turn around and I'm able to execute it much, much better, thankfully. And there are definitely a couple of standout moments like that for me that have occurred. And I think, sometimes it can be difficult because often people will assume that if you study sports psychology, you're going to know all of it and you're able to use it. And the thing I always say is, well, just because a biomechanist knows a lot about the body doesn't mean they have the perfect technique. And I think that's often one of the things with psychology is that, well, you know all of this. Why aren't you able to deliver it in the big performances? And it's just so much more complex. It's so different. So yeah, I really enjoy actually using it for the benefit, and seeing others actually do it as well, for me has been a real pleasure, because I think one of the big things for me in terms of my involvement in sport, certainly last season when I played my last year with Camogie, was this idea of being part of something bigger as well sometimes, and sometimes playing with other teammates can often be a really great way for me to experience flow. I found like there were just some teammates who they either view the pitch in the same way or they just see things in the same way you see them, and you play beside them and work with them. And I always found that really, really interesting. And yeah, I think going back to the question, definitely have certainly tried to harness as much of psychology for sporting performance, and also more recently with my running. I think I'm probably quite curious actually in relation to the running, because that's been quite a new thing I've taken up over the last few months. I have signed up for quite a long race next year as well. So I think part of that is actually I'm curious to know what that experience is like. Because I think there's an element of that can give a lot of meaning as well, to almost have that kaleidoscope of experience that you want to know what that is like. And I think that element of curiosity is probably in a lot of us as well. But yeah, definitely use a lot of psychology when I've tried to perform. Whether it's always worked or not, it's another question.
Yeah, I look forward to hearing how your running goes, not just what happens in the event, but we all know that the process of training towards something is so important. Like whatever happens with that race is sometimes not as important as that journey and having something to look forward to.
Yes, just finishing. I will be very happy if I finish. That's the main thing for me.
Yeah, I've enjoyed our discussion so much, and I also learned a lot. So many interesting things going on in your work. And so if we start wrapping up, if you think of our listeners and they might remember one or two things from this discussion, what would be some of your kind of take-home messages or things that you hope that the listeners will remember from our chat?
Yeah, I think the first one for me, and regardless of your research area of interest, is to always be suppose, don't be afraid to question what's there and whether we can develop understanding by questioning what we already know. I think that's really important, regardless of what our area of research in. I think that element of a critical thought is so important. And number two, I guess, for me is just to think about ways in which we can try to progress our field, and what are the ways that we can do that. So is that developing, in our case of flow, developing new measures? In the case of qualitative work, do we have another option here that we can utilize? And just that can apply more broadly as well, to think more about our methods and how we can use them to advance our understanding. So they would be probably two more generic points. And I suppose just from a flow perspective is I hope people will go away and think, that this idea of being in the zone, it doesn't just potentially happen in one way. There may be different ways, and we must also ensure that we are critical in our thinking in that regard. And also, I'd love to hear more from people about their research. If they're researching in this area and would ever like to get in touch, that would be fantastic as well, and to hear their ideas and have a discussion about those points as well.
Yeah, fantastic. I hope this podcast will also be part of stimulating discussion and helping our field and the flow research to grow and develop and flourish also in the future.
Indeed.
So thank you so much, Trish. I really enjoyed our discussion.
Thank you very much, Nora.
Thanks for joining us this week on Physical Activity Researcher Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing or following the show on Twitter. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. If you found value in the show, we would really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcast or whichever app you're using. Or if you would, in a real old school way, simply tell a friend about the show. It would be a great help for us. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for forthcoming episodes, so be sure to tune in. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.